Adora pushed open a pair of heavy, iron-bound doors, revealing a sanctuary of ancient majesty. The chamber was bathed in the light of pale, azure lanterns hanging at perfect intervals along the circular stone walls, their cool glow casting long, unbroken shadows across the polished floor. Dominating the center of the room was a massive table forged from a single expanse of dark heartwood, its surface intricately scarred with runes and the woven histories of the mountain clans. Around it sat a dozen finely wrought chairs, but it was the ceiling that commanded reverence. High above the table, the living roots and colossal limbs of ancient mountain trees broke through the stone, branching and twisting together to form a soaring, vaulted canopy. Their gnarled wood blended seamlessly with the raw granite, a bridge between the deep earth and the architecture of the elves. Now and again, a single pale leaf would detach from the canopy, drifting silently to rest upon the runic wood below. At the far end of the chamber, 3 figures waited in absolute stillness. Around the table, several of the seats were already occupied. To the left sat an elven matriarch with hair spun of pale gold, her posture rigid. To the right sat 2 elven lords, mirrored in face and scowl, twin brothers draped in heavy silver mantles. Standing at the apex was Rian's grandfather, Hokar. Even bearing the crushing weight of centuries, the old chieftain stood taller than the rest, his presence anchoring the room. He wore a ceremonial mantle of deep forest green, his calloused hands wrapped firmly around a towering staff of ash. Crowned at its zenith was a jagged sapphire that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light, breathing in time with the azure lanterns upon the walls. Flanking Hokar were 2 high elders, their expressions carved from the same weathered stone as the mountain itself. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind Rian and Adora, every eye in the chamber snapped to the prince, the weight of a long-awaited reckoning settling over the quiet hall. "Ah, Rian, you are well enough to join us," Hokar said, his voice a low rumble that beckoned Rian forward. Adora did not follow. Instead, she took up a rigid stance beside the iron-bound doors, her spine straightening as if guarding the threshold against a siege. No command had been given for her to play the sentry, but Rian could see the instinct locked in her very bones. After the horrors they had survived, vigilance was a skin she could not easily shed. "You may stand down, Adora," one of the elders spoke from the head of the table, his tone dismissive. Adora's gaze swept the room, resting momentarily on Rian before locking onto the space above the elders' heads. "I prefer to stand." Rian walked slowly down the length of the runic table, his gaze flickering across the gathered lords. He knew not a single face among them, yet it was painfully evident from the sudden stiffness in their shoulders that they knew precisely who he was. The twin brothers leaned together, trading hushed, urgent whispers as he passed, while the golden-haired matriarch tracked his every step with a burning, unblinking intensity. Drawn by a quiet, inexplicable pull, Rian stopped near the head of the table. He pulled out one of the high-backed chairs and seated himself. Hokar's weathered face softened, a fragile, knowing smile breaking through his silvered beard. "That is where your father sat," Hokar murmured, the raspy weight of his words echoing softly against the stone. The chamber fell into a breathless silence. Grandfather and grandson shared a quiet, unbroken moment beneath the pale light, until Hokar cleared his throat, calling the council back to the present. "The world we left behind did not sleep while you were lost to us, Rian," Hokar began, his voice deepening, seeming to vibrate through the ashwood of his staff. "When we pulled you and the girl from that suffocating abyss, we believed the hardest part of the journey was finished. We brought you up the hidden trails and finally home." He smiled across the table, but the warmth quickly vanished, replaced by the grim lines of a commander facing a bitter winter. His knuckles whitened around his staff. "But while you lay in the dark, the sky to the north began to turn. Our outriders report coordinated movement along the borders of Eithilgard. Fires are choking the high valleys, Rian. Plumes of ash so thick they bleed the morning clouds black. And at night, when the wind howls down from the peaks, it carries the shrieks of things that have no place in the light." Rian watched the faces around the table. The news was not fresh to them, but the fear it commanded was raw and bleeding. "Then all the more reason to seal our gates," one of the twin brothers cut in, leaning heavily over the table. His voice was laced with arrogant dismissal, his fingers idly tracing a battle rune in the wood. "The North has always played with fire, Lord Hokar. It is a distant storm. We have our own borders to hold, our own kin to feed. Let the lowlanders break their swords on their own monsters." The sapphire atop Hokar's staff flared suddenly, throwing sharp blue shadows across his hardened face. Before the chieftain could speak, the elven matriarch slammed her palms flat against the table. Her chair shrieked against the stone floor as she rose, her eyes burning like cold fire. "You mistake cowardice for wisdom," she hissed, her glare fixed on the twin. The twin did not answer, merely offering a patronizing half-smile. The second brother chuckled, a sound that only fueled the matriarch's wrath. "You speak of peace as if it were a fraying blanket you might pull over your head. Those fires are no mere border skirmish. The ash we breathe is the breath of the very malice that plagued our ancestors. If we sit here hiding in the roots while Aethelgard burns, we are merely choosing to be the last morsel the dark swallows. We must strike before their vanguard reaches our valleys." Through the rising tide of shouting, Rian sat in absolute silence. He offered no word, nor did he flinch from the heat of their debate. Resting his hands on the carved armrests of his father's chair, he simply listened. He saw the matriarch's fiery desperation, the twins' stubborn apathy, and the heavy, unbroken gaze of his grandfather. The weight of the world was shifting, and though they spoke of nations and armies, Rian felt the invisible threads of the shadow pulling him back into the eye of the storm. He turned slightly toward the doors, catching Adora staring directly at him. Framed by the pale light, her brow was drawn tight in a sharp, agonizing conflict. The restless energy radiated from her. She was desperate to draw her verbal blade and interject. Yet the ancient hierarchy of the elders chained her tongue. Rian silently prayed she would throw her voice into the fray, if only to buy him a few vital heartbeats to untangle the chaos in his own mind. Before the argument could draw blood, the elder to Hokar's right raised a single, weathered hand. The gesture was absolute. The room fell instantly silent, and the matriarch slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her eyes still smoldering. Hokar bowed his head slightly to his advisor, reclaiming the floor. "I hear the merit in both your paths," Hokar spoke, his voice resonating with heavy sorrow. His gaze drifted across the runes until it settled squarely upon his grandson. "Before now, before our prince was returned to the light, I would have agreed with you." He turned his fierce gaze upon the twins. Under the old man's stare, both brothers shifted, suddenly unable to hold his eyes. "But our kin are possessed by a new violent fire," Hokar continued, the sapphire pulsing brilliantly. "The return of the prince has thrown the Dryad folk into an uproar. When they heard what was done to him in the dark, they demanded—" Hokar froze, the word turning to ash on his tongue. The silence hung heavy. Rian did not need to hear the end of the sentence to know the word locked behind his grandfather's teeth. Vengeance. A cold dread settled over Rian. He had walked the road of vengeance. He had seen it in Sigrid's bitter isolation, in Varric's blind fury, in Zarek's twisted machinations. Every act of blood simply paved the way for another. "They demand a reckoning," Hokar corrected himself softly, though the edge of a blade remained in his tone. "They see the scars Rian bears. They hear of the violence done to his mind, and they view the smoke in the north as a challenge. They want to march. They want to tear down the remnants of the ancient enemy and burn the Inimicus to ash. And they will march to their graves." Adora's voice shattered the quiet. She spoke softer than she intended, but in the breathless hall the words struck like a hammer against a shield. Every eye snapped to the doors. The twins froze. The matriarch leaned forward, lips parted. Adora looked down at her own hands, her thumb tracing the pale, ghostly lines where iron shackles had once bitten into her flesh. "You believe you know the north because you see its smoke," she said, her voice finding its iron, channeling a calm she did not possess. She looked squarely at Rian. "But we have tasted the mind of the enemy. We have felt the weight of its shadow. It cares nothing for our borders, and it feasts upon our wrath. If we march north hunting blood and glory, we are walking directly into the jaw of the trap it set for us. So we do nothing? The matriarch challenged, the hostility drained from her voice, replaced by a hollow desperation. We wait for the dark to swallow the mountain? No, Rian said. He finally looked up, meeting the matriarch's gaze before turning to his grandfather. We do not sit idle, but we do not march out of fury. We must understand why the north burns. We must understand the design Zarek intended for me. The matriarch frowned, her brow furrowing. Who is Zarek? The chamber froze. Confusion rippled across the faces of the council, exchanging lost glances. They do not know his name, Rian thought, dropping his gaze to the table, a flush of embarrassment warming his neck. To them, he was merely a faceless servant of the dark. Only Adora and I knew the old man beneath the monster. He had not noticed Adora slip from the doors. She now stood directly behind him, a silent, immovable guard. Hokar studied his grandson, a profound stillness settling over his ancient features. The sapphire on his staff dimmed to a mere ember as he weighed the boy's words. You speak of traps and grand designs, yet you sit in the seat of a warlord, Hokar said softly, testing him. So tell us, Prince of the Dryads. With the north ablaze and our people screaming for war, what path would you have us walk? The pressure in the room became absolute. The elders, the warring lords, the matriarch, every voice of power in the mountain went silent, waiting for the broken boy to dictate the fate of their realm. Rian looked up at Adora. Her presence was the anchor holding his fractured mind together. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, barely carrying over the crackle of the lanterns. I look around this table, and I see lords who expect me to know their names, Rian began, his hands resting upon the carved wood. But the truth is, I do not. I remember nothing of my life before the dark. I do not remember the songs of this mountain, or the face of my own father, whose chair I now occupy. He drew a slow, steadying breath, his voice finding its footing, rising with a sudden clarion strength. Every face I knew in the false city, every bond I swore, every memory of my youth, it was a meticulously woven lie. Zarek and the entity within him carved away my soul to forge a weapon. Rian leaned forward, his voice shedding all hesitation, ringing through the ancient hall with the authority of the bloodline he carried. They did not break my mind out of mere cruelty. I felt the entity's intent before the mist shattered. They wanted me to return to you, bearing these scars. They engineered my escape so I would take your reinvigorated fire, your desperate thirst for vengeance, and march our armies blindly into a slaughter that would break the elven lines for 1,000 years. The reaction was explosive. The silence shattered into a wall of outrage. The twin brothers bolted upright, their heavy chairs slamming violently against the stone floor. You ask us to gamble the survival of our race on the testimony of a broken mind? The first twin roared, his face flushed purple under the azure light, jabbing a finger at Rian. He admits he remembers nothing. His mind is a playground for their sorcery, and he sits in our sanctuary claiming our very courage is a trap. We are asked to take counsel from a ghost, the second twin bellowed to the high elders. The matriarch struck the table with a deafening crack, her voice cutting through the brothers' fury like a serrated blade. A ghost? She hissed, rising to her full height. He survived the abyssal frosts, broke the shadow's hold, and carried the dawn back to this mountain, and you name him a ghost? Look to the fires. If the enemy desires us to march blindly, then sitting here squabbling as terrified children plays equally into their hands. Rian is the only soul who has peered into the mind of that malice. We are fools to ignore his warning. He is a boy who knows not his own name, the first twin barked back, refusing to yield. His judgment is poisoned, and your pride has made you blind. Adora's voice cracked through the chamber like a whip. She stepped from Rian's flank, her hand locking onto the back of his chair. The sheer, commanding violence in her tone silenced the lords instantly. She ignored the elders entirely, locking her piercing eyes onto the twins. We have marched through the ash of the bone wastes. We have bled in the freezing dark of the umbral lands, and we dragged ourselves from the jaws of a nightmare while you sat safely behind your walls of stone, Adora commanded, her voice vibrating with fierce authority. What we have endured cannot be dismissed. He is not a weapon to be pointed at your foes, and he is no puppet for your politics. Ignore him, and you will march our kin into the very grave he bled to save them from." The atmosphere in the room shifted, the tension pulling tight as a bowstring. The first twin opened his mouth to retort, but the words died in his throat. He exhaled sharply and sank back into his chair. "But what if the boy is wrong?" he muttered bitterly. "What if the shadow still whispers in his mind?" Before the debate could ignite again, the heavy iron doors of the council chamber boomed open with a crash that shook the dust from the roots above. Every head snapped to the threshold. Striding into the pale lantern light was a massive, imposing figure clad in battered, heavy plate steel. The distinct scent of rusted iron, wet ash, and rain followed him. It was Tormund, general of the armies of Nostrador. His heavy, dark cloak was frayed and caked in mud, his chest heaving with the exhaustion of a man who had ridden his mount to death. "Forgive the intrusion, Lord Hokar," Tormund bellowed, his deep, gravelly voice commanding the vast room. He offered a curt, martial nod to the head of the table. "And forgive my delay. I would have made the gates by dusk, but the slaughter required my blade. The rumors do not do it justice. The entire northern expanse of Uldanor is breaking under siege. It is an absolute massacre. I was forced to split my host. The bulk of my forces hold the defensive lines to keep Nostrador from falling entirely." The elves recoiled at the news. They had believed the fires were confined to Eithilgard. The revelation that the western continent of Uldanor was burning shifted the scale of the war from a border skirmish to a global ruin. But for Rian, the words struck him with the force of a physical blow. Nostrador. Panic, sharp and blinding, flared in his chest. A breath caught like jagged glass in his throat. His fingers clamped onto the edge of the runic table as the stone walls seemed to tilt and spin. Nostrador. That was the name of the false city. It was the name of the lie Zarek had built to cage his mind, the very theater where his identity had been systematically butchered. Hearing it spoken by a living general, as a living fortress currently drowning in blood, sent a wave of suffocating vertigo through him. For one terrifying heartbeat, he did not know if he had escaped the illusion, or if the illusion had simply expanded to consume the mountain. Adora sensed the terrifying shift in his posture instantly. She saw his knuckles turn white against the wood, saw the hollow terror flashing in his eyes. Without a word, she moved closer, placing a heavy, grounding hand flat against his shoulder. The warmth and pressure of her grip anchored him to the stone, dragging his mind back from the precipice of Zarek's madness. Hokar's sharp eyes caught the exchange, but the old chieftain kept his focus on the human general. He extended a welcoming hand. "Step forward, General Tormund. Take a seat among us," Hokar said, his raspy voice laced with profound gratitude. "We honor your presence, especially when your own walls are tested. In an age as dark as this, it is a rare and powerful sight to see the men of the West and the elves of the mountains stand together." Despite the chieftain's grace, the air in the chamber instantly soured with ancient prejudice. As Tormund strode down the length of the table, his steel sabatons ringing against the stone, he was met with a wall of silent, piercing hostility. The twin lords narrowed their eyes with blatant disgust, while the matriarch crossed her arms, her face hardening into a mask of distrust. The blood spilt between their races was a river too wide for a single crisis to bridge. Sensing the volatility, a nervous, low-ranking attendant scurried from the shadows. With trembling hands, the elf placed a finely wrought silver goblet upon the wood directly before Tormund. Lifting a clay pitcher, he filled the chalice with a rich, dark mountain wine, the sweet, heavy aroma briefly masking the smell of slaughter that clung to the general. Tormund reached for the goblet, the steel of his gauntlet clinking softly against the silver. He raised it toward his lips. Before the rim could touch his mouth, the first twin spoke. The word was barely a whisper, yet it slipped into the room like a drawn dagger. "Careful." The chamber held its breath. The distant crackle of the hearth seemed to die. Tormund froze, his gauntlet suspended in midair. Slowly, his dark, battle-hardened eyes shifted from the wine, locking directly onto the lord who had spoken. The twin did not flinch. Bathed in the azure light, he leaned forward a fraction, his voice dripping with venom. "The last time a man drank among us," the twin murmured, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. It did not end well. Several elders cast their eyes downward. Hokar's grip tightened around his ash staff, a silent challenge issued in a room teeming with ancient pride. Tormund did not blink. He offered no roar of anger, no demand for satisfaction, nor did he look to Hokar for defense. Instead, his armored fingers simply tightened around the silver stem. Without breaking eye contact for a single, terrifying second, the human general brought the goblet to his lips. He took a long, deliberate draught of the ruby wine, his unbroken stare boring into the twins' very soul. He set the goblet down with a heavy, resounding thud. No words were needed. In that single, unyielding act of defiance, an absolute, begrudging respect crashed over the council. The twin lord held Tormund's gaze for one heartbeat more, then finally, quietly looked away. Rian watched the exchange in silent awe. He thought of Varric, who would have drawn steel and screamed for blood at the insult. But this general understood the weight of his rank. He had conquered the room without unseating his blade. "Let us return to the fate of our world," Hokar commanded, striking the floor once with his staff. The sapphire flared brilliantly, sweeping the lingering tension away. Tormund wiped his mouth with the back of his gauntlet and leaned his heavy forearms against the runic wood. "The vanguard I marched through the passes is currently holding the western banks of the watery gorge," Tormund reported grimly. "They are armed, provisioned, and ready to break the northern lines at a moment's notice. They await my word. The second a single fire arrow arcs westward over these peaks, my outriders will see it, and the host will march." Hokar nodded slowly, his silver beard brushing his chest as a sorrowful, ancient pride filled his eyes. "My kin boast few true soldiers, General," Hokar replied, his voice heavy. "We are a scattered people, scarred by harsh winters and ancient raids. But make no mistake, the blood of this mountain is iron. They refuse to wait in the dark for the slaughter. They will lend whatever strength they possess to your shield wall." "And I will march with them," Rian said. The words were spoken softly, but they severed the air with absolute finality. Rian stood tall beside Adora, his hands resting upon the back of his father's chair. The hesitation burned entirely from his spine. Every eye turned to the prince. The twins stared in stunned silence, the matriarch's breath caught, and Tormund regarded the boy with a sudden, sharpened curiosity. Beside him, Adora remained still as a statue, but he felt the faint, fierce pride radiating from her. Hokar stared at his grandson for a long, agonizing moment. The old man drew a deep, ragged breath, the desperate fear of a grandfather warring violently with the grim duty of a chieftain. Slowly the warlord won. "I would expect nothing less from the blood of the Min Eldoreth," Hokar said softly. "Your father would have drawn his blade for the same cause," Adora murmured at his side. "You shall have a place of honor in my vanguard, Prince," Tormund stated, bowing his head. Rian met the general's gaze and nodded. "I could not save you from the horrors of the north before, my boy," Hokar said, his voice thick with emotion. "But this time I swear by the roots of this mountain, I will not let the dark take you." "Then there is no more waiting in the shadows," the second twin declared, slamming his fist against his chest. "Aye," the first twin echoed, exchanging a solemn nod with his brother. "Aye," the matriarch breathed, her eyes shining with tears and fire. The die was cast, the bones thrown upon the ancient wood. Beneath the root-woven ceiling of the mountain hall, history had violently shifted course. For the first time in an age, the elves of Aethelgard and the men of Nostrudor had cast aside the bitter poison of their past, binding their fates together against the suffocating tide sweeping down from the north. Yet, as the council began to disperse into hushed, urgent murmurs, a cold dread settled deep in Rian's marrow. He was profoundly grateful they were no longer waiting for the executioner's axe. But the crushing reality of war pressed upon his chest. He knew the cost of glory. Beneath the grand speeches of lords and generals, thousands of good people were about to bleed into the snow. The thought made his stomach churn, for in the darkest, quietest corners of his mind, a devastating truth lingered. He was the catalyst. If he had not survived the abyss, if his broken face had not ignited their thirst for a reckoning, would these armies still be marching to their graves? Or was this exact moment, this grand, unified march to war precisely what the shadow in the north had planned all along?